In this video, I'll be talking about some competitors who I believe were the biggest what-ifs in all of bodybuilding when it comes to unfulfilled potential. I did make a video like this in the past, however, I thought that I could spice things up by turning it into a tier list and adding more competitors as well. Don't take this list that seriously, obviously, because all the competitors on this list were obviously great, but I will say that I do think all of them left something on the table. With that being said, for the tier list, I will use my usual S plus through C. S plus is going to be for those competitors who truly wasted all of their potential, in my opinion. S is for those who wasted a large part of what they could have achieved. A is for competitors who still left a lot on the table, despite having relatively good careers. B is for those who fulfilled most of their potential, but did have some missed opportunities. And finally, C is for competitors who achieved nearly everything that they were capable of, in my opinion, with only minor what-ifs. In short, the higher the tier, the more potential wasted. Alright, first up is Paul Delet. He exploded onto the scene in the early 1990s and immediately found a lot of success. Standing at around 6'1", or even 6'3", so I've heard, Paul had an absolutely enormous frame with some of the widest shoulders and cartoonish proportions of that entire era. His arms were massive, his chest was full, and his silhouette looked like something out of a comic book. He placed in the top 6 at the Olympia several times and was a consistent contender at very big shows, which was impressive given how deep the lineups were in the 90s. But for me, Paul is a prime example of wasted potential. He had all the raw genetics, crazy proportion, insane size, and very solid separation, but he never learned how to put it all together. His posing was notoriously awkward and stiff, which always made him look worse compared to more polished competitors. His back development lagged behind badly, and even though he had years to bring it up, he never really improved upon it. His condition was also inconsistent, often coming in off the mark when it truly mattered, and I genuinely believe that if he had committed to mastering presentation and refining his weaker areas, he could have definitely been a legitimate multiple-time Mr. Olympia champion. I'm going to put Paul Delet in the A tier because while he still had a very successful career by many standards, he left a huge amount of potential on the table that he never truly capitalized on. Next up is Dennis Wolf. Now, Dennis made his mark in the late 2000s and early 2010s when the lineups were stacked with huge names like Phil Heath, Jay Cutler, as well as Kai Green. He was known for having one of the most unreal structures in modern bodybuilding, a combination of extreme width, tall stature, and a very tight waistline that made his silhouette stand out instantly. Even as a mass monster himself, and as other mass monsters were taking over, Dennis managed to keep all the flowing lines and aesthetic proportions, which was very rare for someone at his size. He looked absolutely massive and imposing, from the front at least, and had a presence on stage that very few could match. But despite all of that, Dennis definitely had a few key areas that were weaknesses. His back, for example, never quite caught up to the front. He had the width, but not the same level of thickness or detail, especially in the lower lats. His lower body condition as well, especially from behind and not from the front, which was amazing, but yeah, from behind it was kind of inconsistent. There were shows where his hamstrings and glutes did look a bit soft compared to the rest of his physique. The most unfortunate part of the story, though, is that right when he was at the peak of his career, he suffered a very serious spinal injury that basically forced him into retirement. Because of all that, I'm going to have to place Dennis Wolf in A tier, because he had the genetics and the structure to be a Mr. Olympia champion, but between injuries and some gaps in his physique, he never truly reached that ceiling. Moving on to Lee Priest, who is one of the most recognizable and respected bodybuilders of all time, and a lot of that comes down to his insane genetics. Even as a teenager, he was packing more muscle than most grown men, and over the years he built some of the best arms ever seen, including the biceps, triceps, and forearms. All of them were amazing. On top of all that, he had great shape, full muscle bellies, and an ability to grow that almost nobody could match, maybe apart from Kevin Levrone. But despite all of those gifts, Lee never really managed to capitalize on them when it came to winning the biggest titles. He was always a fan favorite and a top contender, but he could never really break through and, take a major title during his prime. He did eventually win big shows like the Night of Champions and the Iron Man in 2005 and 2006 respectively, if I am correct, but both did come later in his career, which shows that if he had stayed consistent and kept competing, he could have definitely achieved a lot more. A lot of people also think he would have been the best 212 competitor ever if he had stuck around for that, especially since he mounted a successful comeback in 2013 in the NABA Federation. The main reasons he fell short, though, in my opinion, were that his glute and hamstring condition were sometimes a bit behind, and the genetic depth of other competitors in his era definitely made it harder to stand out. But even more than that, his outspoken personality, while a huge part of why people love him, no doubt played a huge role in how politics affected his placings. He was never afraid to say exactly what he thought, and in a sport where relationships with judges and federations do matter, that probably held him back more than anything. So I'm gonna put Lee Priest in S tier, because he had some of the best genetics ever, and, I would say that had he not been so outspoken, and also been more consistent when it came to condition, he could have definitely been a whole lot more impressive overall. Next up is Chris Cormier. Now, Chris was one of the most talented and complete bodybuilders of the 90s and the early 2000s. He had incredible shape and proportion, with flowing lines, great muscle bellies, and the kind of balanced physique that looked almost artistic or statuesque. Throughout his career, he was consistently in the mix at big shows, and racked up multiple Arnold Classic runner-up placings, showing just how good he was when he was on. But for me, Chris is a perfect example of wasted potential, because he never truly pushed himself to maximize what he had. His condition, especially in the lower body from behind, like the glutes and the hamstrings, was often a bit behind, not always, but definitely more often than not, and in my opinion, that's definitely something that kept him from breaking through. I also heard a story that Dorian Yates offered to help train Chris and take him to that next level, but Chris only accepted that offer much later into his career, when he was already dealing with injuries and nearing retirement. If he had locked in earlier and worked with someone like Dorian at his best, I genuinely believe he could have been more dangerous when it came to the Olympia, or even maybe had, won one of those Arnold Classic titles. Overall, though, I'm going to put Chris Cormier in the A tier because he had amazing genetics and shape, but a combination of inconsistent condition and not truly committing to that next level of intensity left a lot of his potential unrealized. Also, if you guys are enjoying the video so far, a like and sub would be awesome, as it helps out the channel tremendously. Here we have Lou Ferrigno, who was one of the youngest competitors in the sport during the 1970s, and even in his early 20s, he was already placing very highly at the Olympia. In 1974, he took second in the heavyweight class, and in 75, he finished in third. Granted, the lineups back then were definitely not as deep as later eras, but placing that high at such a young age showed just how much raw potential I would say that he had. Then, instead of staying in the sport and developing further, Lou walked away after 1975 to focus on acting in the film industry, which was a pretty good decision as he ended up becoming the Hulk, which is, something that we're all pretty fond of. He basically gave up the second half of the 70s and 80s, though, when it came to bodybuilding, which were the prime years where he could have built upon his massive frame, improved upon the condition, and completely dominated that Olympia stage. When he finally came back in the 1990s, he looked phenomenal, still big, still very imposing, but the sport had evolved so much that even his impressive physique could not match the size and density and condition of someone like Dorian Yates or the aesthetics of Flex Wheeler. Honestly, if he had stayed active after 1975, especially with Arnold retiring the same year, I think he totally could have won multiple Olympias. Considering he was so young and very much improving, I think he probably could have held the title throughout the late 70s and early 80s, possibly until Lee Haney. With the added mass and maturity, it's not even out of the question that he possibly could have pushed Lee Haney in those early years. Now, I'm going to put Lou Ferrigno in S tier because he had the structure, the width, and the freak factor to definitely be an all-time great, but stepping away early during his prime meant that he could never really come close to fulfilling what he could have accomplished. Next up is Kevin Levrone. Kevin is one of the most accomplished bodybuilders of all time, with a career that spanned into the 90s and the early 2000s, and then even a comeback in 2016. He built one of the most complete and aesthetic physiques of all time, with very full 3D muscles, incredible shoulders and triceps, and great stage presence that made him a perennial Olympia contender. He won multiple Arnold Classic titles and beat some of the greatest names of all time, consistently placing near the top for over a decade. One thing that always gets brought up about Kevin is that he famously would go completely off gear and dial back his training for much of the year, and then ramp it up hard only about 3 months before the contest. Even he has said that he would never have changed that approach because it worked for him mentally and physically, while some people think he definitely could have pushed harder year round. Now, when it comes to his runner-up finishes, I honestly think that they were never truly close. All but one of those second place showings were to very dominant versions of guys like Dorian Yates or Ronnie Coleman, and in my opinion, the only real outlier was 2002, where Ronnie came in downsized, and maybe if Kevin had been at his absolute best, he could have pulled off the upset, but even then, that's kind of debatable. Overall, Kevin still accomplished almost everything you could want in the sport, aside from obviously winning the Olympia. He had a legendary physique, won major titles, and left a huge impact in and outside of the sport. For that reason, I'm going to put Kevin Levrone in C tier because in my view, he fulfilled almost all of his potential, and any what-ifs are pretty minor compared to what he actually achieved. Moving on to Lionel Baki, who had eye-catching genetics for shape and aesthetics. He had incredibly round, full muscle everywhere, especially in the chest, arms, and quads, and his physique had that kind of flow and balance that reminded a lot of people of a modern-day Flex Wheeler. When you saw him in the front relaxed, or any frontal pose for that matter, it was obvious he had the structure and the shape to be one of the very best of all time. But despite all that potential, Lionel never really figured out how to bring the next level condition that he needed to capitalize on that shape. He would show up soft or holding water almost every time he stepped on stage. Maybe one or two times he got close to being really sharp, but even then it was never really good enough to seriously challenge the top competitors. It is honestly one of the most frustrating examples of wasted potential, because if he had ever come in fully shredded with that kind of genetic base, he could have been a legitimate Olympia contender. I'm gonna have to put Lionel Baki in the S+ tier because he had everything needed to be a superstar, but he wasted almost all of it by never truly figuring out how to nail that condition. Next up is Kai Greene. Kai built one of the most impressive physiques of the modern era and of all time, with insane size, round muscle, and stage presence, and posing as well, that made him a standout instantly. He pushed Phil Heath harder than anyone else during their rivalry, and from 2011 to 2014, he was consistently right there in second place, looking like he could potentially take the title if everything lined up perfectly. A lot of people feel that if Kai had stayed in the game and kept competing after the 2014 Olympia, he could have pushed Phil even further, especially if he brought his absolute best. To be fair, he was already a lot older than Phil, so I'm not really sure how realistic it would have been to maintain that peak for years to come, but it is clear that after losing to Phil a few times, he started to mentally check out of the competitive scene. He focused more on acting, appearances, and other ventures, and never truly returned to try to finish what he started. For me, Kai is the definition of someone who had all the tools and the momentum to potentially win the Olympia one day, but ultimately let the mental side of the sport get in the way. I'm gonna put Kai Greene in A tier because while he still accomplished a lot and built a very impressive legacy, there's always going to be that big what if about what would have happened if he kept going. Now we have Matt Mendenhall, and Matt is one of the most famous examples of wasted potential in all of bodybuilding history. He was literally nicknamed Mr. Genetics, a guy with almost perfect structure, shape, and muscle insertions that looked like they were carved out of stone. Even Lee Haney, who was a 8-time Mr. Olympia champion, said that Matt was one of the few competitors he truly feared had he got a pro card. His exact quote was, "The guy's a walking, talking He-Man. Perfect calves, wide back, great biceps, great chest, great thighs. He had everything." But despite all of that raw talent and genetics, Matt could never get over the barrier and actually turn pro. In every pro qualifier, he would end up as the runner-up or just barely missing out on that pro card. To be fair, turning pro back then was a whole lot harder than it is today. There were fewer opportunities and fewer cards handed out, but even so, it felt like every time Matt was close to breaking through, something would get in the way. I'm going to put Matt Menhal in the S+ tier because he had some of the most complete genetics ever seen, but never ever made it to the pro ranks, which makes his career one of the biggest what-ifs in the sport's history. Next is Flex Wheeler. Flex is often called the most genetically gifted bodybuilder of all time when it comes to shape and proportion. He had nearly perfect muscle bellies, an incredibly small waist, and a flow to his physique that was picture perfect. At his best, he looked like a human action figure, and even legends like Arnold and Ronnie have called his physique one of the best ever. Unfortunately, though, Flex never reached the true heights that many people believed he could. A big part of that was due to his kidney disease, which took a serious toll on his physique over time, especially in the glutes and hamstrings. He had a harder time getting truly shredded as the disease progressed, and while some of that was out of his control, I do think that had he been more proactive about it earlier, he might have prevented or at least lessened some of the impact. Another factor is that Flex was never known for training as hard as guys like Ronnie or even Dorian. If you watch his training videos, you can see that he often goes through the motions, with sometimes lighter weight and definitely less intensity. Easier for them at first, but eventually someone comes along who not only has greater genetics, but also unmatched work ethic, and then it's game over. Because of all that, I'm going to put Flex Wheeler in B tier, because even though he still had a very incredible career and definitely won major titles, there's no questioning he left something on the table by not pushing harder and managing his health more aggressively. Moving on to Shawn Rhoden, Shawn made history in 2018 when he dethroned Phil Heath to become Mr. Olympia, bringing a combination of impeccable condition, classic lines, and overall shape that a lot of people felt was exactly what the sport needed. He set a new standard for aesthetics in an era that was becoming more dominated by sheer size as well as bubble guts, and his win was one of the most shocking and impressive moments in all of bodybuilding. But after that incredible high point, Shawn's career took a tragic turn. He was sidelined by legal trouble that kept him from defending his title in 2019, and a lot of people believe he would have easily won that year. Looking at the way the judging was shifting, I also think Shawn had the tools to beat Big Ramy in 2020 or even 2021. His lines, proportions, and condition were simply on another level when it came to being at his best. Unfortunately, his untimely passing ended any chance of seeing how that story might have played out, and it left a lot of fans wondering what could have been had circumstances been different. So I'm putting Shawn Rhoden in B tier because while he did achieve the ultimate goal of winning the Mr. Olympia, the abrupt end of his career means that there will always be questions about how many more titles he could have won. Next up is Cedric McMillan. Cedric was undoubtedly one of the most promising and aesthetic competitors of the 2010s, known for having a classic physique that looked like it belonged in the 70s or 80s, but blown up to modern proportion. He had an incredible frame, wide shoulders, small waist, and very long flowing limbs that gave him that trademark shape. When he nailed his condition, he looked phenomenal, and that's definitely a part of why he won the Arnold Classic in 2017. But for as much potential as Cedric had, he rarely managed to bring everything together consistently. His condition was hit or miss at best, almost every time he stepped on stage, and it was always frustrating because you could see how good he truly was. Beyond that, it felt like Cedric never fully committed to maximizing every single variable. His prep, his mindset, and his attention to detail sometimes seemed more relaxed compared to guys who dominated the Olympia stage. Tragically, his untimely passing cut off any chance of a late career resurgence, and it left a lot of people wondering how much more he could have done. Overall, I'm putting Cedric McMillan in the S tier because he had one of the most beautiful and genetically gifted physiques of all time, but inconsistent condition, and his early death meant that he could never come close to fulfilling all that potential. Now we move on to Tom Prince. Tom was a very promising bodybuilder who earned his IFBB Pro card by winning the 1997 MPC National Championships, which was actually the only overall title of his entire career. At 5'8" and around 230 pounds on stage, sometimes ballooning up to over 300 in the offseason, Tom was known for his massive size and thickness, especially for his height. His highest pro placing was third place at the 2001 Night of Champions, which showed glimpses of how much potential he had when things actually came together. Unfortunately, Tom's career was cut short by serious health problems. He suffered from a rare kidney-related disease, which might have been caused by genetics, drug use, or a combination of other factors, and the disease forced him to retire early, and later on even a kidney transplant eventually failed, leaving him dependent on dialysis multiple times a week. It's really tragic because he was really just hitting his stride early in the 2000s, and a lot of people believed he could have pushed into the upper ranks of the IFBB if he had more time and better health. Even though he would find success later on outside of bodybuilding, his passing in 2022 from cancer-related complications completely closed the door on what was already a story of unrealized potential. I'm going to put Tom Prince in S+ tier because he had massive genetic gifts and was just really starting to break through, but his career and life were tragically cut short before he even ever got close to fulfilling what he could have done. Here we have Victor Martinez. Now, Victor was one of the most complete bodybuilders of the 2000s with incredible shape, immense pop and fullness, and the kind of balance that made him stand out in any lineup. His career definitely peaked in 2007 when he came into the Olympia off an Arnold Classic win and in phenomenal condition, and in my opinion was part of the biggest robbery the sport has ever seen. A lot of people still believe he clearly beat Jay Cutler that year and should have been crowned Mr. Olympia. After that show, Victor was never really quite the same. He sat out the 2008 season due to a series of injuries, including a severe knee injury, and other personal issues that took a major toll on his mindset and focus. Later on, he also dealt with legal trouble, including time in jail over immigration and business-related issues, which only made it harder for him to get back into his prime. Even though he still competed until 2020 and had some very solid showings in between, he never recaptured that look he had in 2007 when he was right at the doorstep of becoming Mr. Olympia. So I'm putting Victor Martinez in the A tier because while he still had a great career and almost reached that top level, there's no question that he left a lot of potential unfulfilled after that incredible run in the mid-2000s. Finally, we have Mike Menser. Mike is one of the most famous names in all of bodybuilding history, and a lot of people still tout him as the uncrowned Mr. Olympia of 1980. Personally, I think that reputation is pretty overblown. He was definitely a great competitor, but the idea that he was robbed of the title outright doesn't really hold up in my opinion when you look very closely at that lineup. That said, there's no denying that Mike was a very accomplished bodybuilder with some huge achievements. In 1978, he earned a perfect score at the Mr. Universe, which is something almost nobody has ever done. The following year, he took first place in the heavyweight class at the Olympia, only losing the overall title to Frank Zane, who was arguably still in his prime and at his best. Mike had a dense, very thick physique with great arms and a impressive chest, I would say as well. Not the best of all time though, and more importantly a very impressive midsection when he pulled a vacuum, and he also brought a level of muscularity that was undoubtedly ahead of its time, but the main reason he is on this list after all is the controversial 1980 Mr. Olympia, where he basically walked away from competing altogether because he was so frustrated and disillusioned with the sport. If he hadn't let that disappointment push him into retirement early, I think he definitely could have built an even more impressive career for himself, especially during the late 80s. So I'm putting Mike Menser into that S+ tier because while he was already very successful overall, he left a lot of potential on the table by stepping away early when he still had so much left to prove. Alright guys, that about does it for the video though. Let me know down below if you guys did enjoy this one, as I always hope you do, and if there's anything else you want to add in the comments, please let me know down below. With that all being said though, I do hope to see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching.